Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I am flying solo this week. I'll be delivering both the Washington Report and the call to action. Let's get right to it. The House and Senate will both return Monday and stay in session through Thursday. Last week in the House came back on Monday and voted to pass 3 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House took up H-Res 161, a rule governing floor consideration of 2 joint resolutions and a concurrent resolution. The House leadership held the vote open for more than an hour as it struggled to lock down the votes necessary to pass the next resolution the leadership wanted to bring to the floor, which was the concurrent resolution, H-Con Res 14, also known as the House Budget Resolution. But the votes didn't appear to be there. There were 4 holdouts among GOP members, and that meant that the resolution would fail. So the leadership announced it was pulling the bill, and everyone could go home for the night. But moments later, a breakthrough occurred as 3 of the holdouts declared they would vote in support of the resolution. So the leadership declared that the vote was back on, and everyone should return to the chamber. They called the vote on H-Con Res 14, and when the votes were tallied, the resolution passed by a vote of 217 to 215, with Republican Thomas Massie of Kentucky the only member of either party to cross party lines. Then the House passed 2 more bills under suspension of the rules. On Wednesday, the House took up and passed another bill under suspension of the rules. Then the House took up and passed H.J. Res 35, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval. On Thursday, the House took up and passed another resolution of disapproval. This week, the House will return Monday with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House will consider 7 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday and for the balance of the week, the House is scheduled to consider 3 bills pursuant to a rule. They are H.J. Res 61, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval of the rule submitted by the Environmental Protection Agency relating to national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, rubber tire manufacturing. H.J. Res 42, a CRA resolution of disapproval of the rules submitted by the Department of Energy relating to Energy Conservation Program for appliance standards, certification requirements, labeling requirements, and enforcement provisions for certain consumer products and commercial equipment. And S.J. Res 11, a CRA resolution of disapproval of the rules submitted by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management relating to protection of marine archaeological resources. Last week in the Senate came back on Monday and voted to end debate on the nomination of Daniel Driscoll to serve as Secretary of the Army. Then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Jamison Greer to serve as U.S. Trade Representative. On Tuesday, the Senate voted to confirm Daniel Driscoll to serve as Secretary of the Army. Then the Senate agreed to a motion to proceed to S.J. Res 11, a CRA resolution of disapproval. Then the Senate voted to pass that CRA resolution of disapproval and send it to the House. Then the Senate agreed to a motion to proceed to executive session so it could consider the nomination of Linda McMahon to serve as Secretary of Education. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to confirm Jamison Greer to serve as U.S. Trade Representative. Then the Senate rejected S.J. Res 10, offered by Democrat Tim Kaine of Virginia, to terminate the national emergency declared with respect to energy. Then the Senate agreed to a motion to proceed to a CRA resolution of disapproval. On Thursday, the Senate voted to pass a different CRA resolution of disapproval. Then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Linda McMahon to serve as Secretary of Energy, and then they were done. This week in the Senate, they'll come back Monday with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to 2 roll call votes. The first will be on confirmation of Linda McMahon to serve as Secretary of Education, and the second will be a motion to end debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 2, S9, the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a vote to confirm President Trump's nominee for Secretary of Labor, Lori Chavez DeRemer. Now, let's talk about cabinet confirmations. Lori Chavez DeRemer, President Trump's nominee to serve as Secretary of Labor, made it through her Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee last week by winning the votes of 3 Democrats on the committee because Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul voted against her. If the Democrats had not voted for her in committee, her nomination would not have made it out of the committee. But now that she's made it out of the committee, I would not be surprised to see a vote on her confirmation on the Senate floor later this week. Now let's talk about media moves. Since last November's elections, there have been multiple moves among the dominant media. At CNN, Chris Wallace, Jim Acosta, and Allison Camerata have left. At NBC, Chuck Todd announced his departure from the network after leaving Meet the Press last year. On Monday, MSNBC continued the media moves, announcing that Joy Reid and Alex Wagner would both be losing their weekday evening shows. And then NBC nightly news anchor Lester Holt announced he would be departing his position later this year. On Wednesday, there was a print media bombshell, as Washington Post owner Jeff Bezos, who became a billionaire as the founder of Amazon, announced that henceforth the editorial line of the longtime liberal mainstay would defend, quote, personal liberties and free markets, unquote. This follows Bezos' decision in the run-up to the November election to block the publication by the Washington Post of an endorsement for Kamala Harris for president, which led to outrage among the staff, who seem to think the owners should just continue to pay for them as they produce money-losing journalism. The Washington Post has been losing about $100 million a year for the last several years. David Moranis, whose biographical works have been subsidized by his position at the Post, tweeted that he would never write another word for the Washington Post as long as Jeff Bezos is the owner. Now let's talk about Trump executive orders. On Saturday, President Trump signed an executive order designating English as the official language of the United States. I must say, I have a personal interest in this. My mother was an immigrant to this country who arrived here speaking relatively little English. She learned the language because she was determined to be able to speak in the native tongue of her adopted home country. It means a lot to me. I even spent time at one point in my career earlier working for an organization whose primary mission was to push for legislation making English the official language. As the executive order explains, quote, from the founding of our republic, English has been used as our national language. Our nation's historic governing documents, including the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, have all been written in English. It is therefore long past time that English is declared as the official language of the United States. A nationally designated language is at the core of a unified and cohesive society, and the United States is strengthened by a citizenry that can freely exchange ideas in one shared language. To promote unity, cultivate a shared American culture for all citizens, ensure consistency in government operations, and create a pathway to civic engagement, it is in America's best interest for the federal government to designate one and only one official language. End quote. Now to the latest on government funding. 1 week from Friday, the current continuing resolution expires. That means congressional negotiators and the president have 10 days left to fashion a bill to keep the government funded and open, or there will be at least a temporary partial government shutdown until such time as they do. The issue that's kept Democrats and Republicans from coming to agreement isn't the overall spending levels, what the Washington Swamp refers to as the top line spending levels, and it's not the allocation of particular spending levels to this program or that. It's an unprecedented demand by Democrats for the inclusion of language that binds President Trump to spending all the money appropriated by the bill, as the Congress lays out. Republicans simply are not willing to agree to this. They don't think it's constitutional. They actually think it's an unconstitutional usurpation, taking power from the president, and they won't do it. Democrats insist that not only is it constitutional, but necessary. They say President Trump has demonstrated already his willingness and his determination to impound funds appropriated by the Congress. That is, to refuse to spend money the Congress already allocated to some program. They point to a law passed in 1974, the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, and say that law requires the president to spend every penny appropriated by the Congress in the manner and for the purpose for which the Congress appropriated it. President Trump and his lawyers respond that the law itself is unconstitutional. They say that appropriating money is a legislative function and is the proper purview of the Congress. But spending money is an executive function and is therefore the proper purview of the president. Trump and his lawyers are looking for a test case to take the question to court so they can put it in front of the Supreme Court. But that's down the road. For now, the so-called four corners, that is the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee and the chairman and the ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee, have to try to fashion legislation to keep the government open. The best bet at this point is a continuing resolution that lasts for the rest of the fiscal year through September 30. That would mean that the entire fiscal year of 2025, which began on October 1, 2024, and ends on September 30, 2025, would be funded by continuing resolution. That means that none of the adjustments to spending programs made by the various appropriations subcommittees in the House and Senate during the course of this year would go into effect. We'd be spending money on the same programs and at the same rate as last year. That would be a failure for the Republicans in Congress. They had the opportunity back in December to pass an omnibus spending bill that wrapped all the various spending bills into one. But they don't like doing that because it makes it hard to focus on any one spending bill when they're all thrown into one giant bill that's 3,000 pages long. So instead they punt and say, let's just do a continuing resolution for a few months to give us time to put together an omnibus that we all like. And then they fail to do that. Here's a simple axiom. Congress will never act until it has to act, and then it will only act as much as it must act. So instead of having used this last 2.5 months to put together the spending bill that makes necessary changes to the various spending programs the government funds every year, Congress didn't. And now Congress will end up funding an entire year's worth of government at the same spending levels and on the same programs as last year without any major adjustments. That's bad governing. And it might not even happen. There's no guarantee that we don't have a temporary partial government shutdown a week and a half from now. Speaker Johnson has changed his position on a key aspect of the CR he wants. Last week, he was talking about making some small adjustments to the spending levels, what the swamp calls anomalies. He was talking last week about factoring in the cuts made by the Department of Government Efficiency. After all, if DOGE has fired almost 10,000 people from USAID and another 7,000 from the Social Security Administration, why would you appropriate money to continue paying their salaries? But obviously, Democrats would oppose that. And he's going to need Democrat votes to pass the CR because there are a bunch of Republicans in the House who simply will not vote for a CR. That gives the Democrats leverage. And with his margin as small as it is, that means he needs at least some Democrat votes to get to 218. Again, that gives the Democrats leverage. Over the weekend, he changed his tune. Now he's talking about what we call a clean CR. That is, a CR that keeps spending levels pretty much where they were last year on pretty much everything. There will be some minor adjustments, some small anomalies, but now he says he wants it as clean as can be. The House will go first on this, and the first test will be whether or not the House can pass a rule to bring a clean rest of the year CR to the floor with just GOP votes. Democrats may provide votes on final consideration to pass the CR, but they'll want to see if Speaker Johnson can pass the rule with just Republican votes. Now let's talk about reconciliation action. The House took a major step last Tuesday night, passing H-Con Res 14, the House Budget Resolution. As we discussed a moment ago, it passed by a vote of 217 to 215. That budget resolution calls for cutting taxes by up to $4.5 trillion over 10 years and cutting spending by up to $2 trillion over 10 years. Let me put that in context for you. The current spending plan calls for spending $84 trillion over the next decade rather than the $86 trillion some would prefer. When you're talking about such large numbers, a $2 trillion savings doesn't really sound like much, does it? The good news is it calls for changes to the tax code. That would allow us to avoid the expiration of the 2017 tax cuts. But there's not enough room in the House resolution to make those changes permanent, and that's a problem, because all the Republican senators on the Senate Finance Committee have signed a letter declaring they will not vote for a budget that does not make those tax cuts permanent. The Senate budget resolution, by contrast, limits itself to adding some money for defense and some more money for border security and energy development. It costs out at about $340 billion. All the new spending is offset by cuts from spending programs, and it doesn't say anything about taxes. Now the bargaining begins, and here's where the very first question will be, what are the assumptions underlying your budget? The House budget uses what we call the current law baseline, while the Senate is using what we call the current policy baseline. The two are very different, and the decision on which one to use is key to the whole enterprise. Let me try to explain. Under current policy, taxes are lower than they were in 2016, before President Trump and the Congress in 2017 enacted the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the TCJA. Under current law, taxes will go up massively at the end of the year when the TCJA personal tax cuts expire. In fact, if the law is not changed and the 2017 tax cuts expire, 62% of the households in America will see a tax increase, and it will be the biggest tax increase in American history. It would devastate the economy and devastate the personal finances of most Americans. The current policy says taxes are low. If we use the current policy as the baseline, then keeping the tax rates right where they are, that is, maintaining the current policy, costs nothing. The Senate parliamentarian, I am reliably informed, has signed off on this, and that's key. Because if the Senate parliamentarian doesn't sign off, it becomes very hard to get things through the Senate on a reconciliation bill. All the Republicans in the Senate are on board with using the current policy baseline. All the Republicans in the House are on board with using the current law baseline. But if they use the current policy baseline, they'll be able to maintain the current policy. If they use the current law baseline, they have to acknowledge they're quote-unquote cutting taxes by $4.5 trillion, which requires them to come up with offsetting spending cuts in order to fit into the budget window. And both sides of the argument, that is, Republicans in the House and in the Senate, want to make these tax cuts permanent. Now, after passing the House budget resolution without using the current policy baseline, Speaker Johnson has agreed to use the current policy baseline for consideration of the final budget resolution that will be worked out between the two houses. That is a huge concession to the Senate side. Speaker Johnson wants to have a vote on the final package after April 1, because that's when the Florida special elections occur, to fill the two open seats left vacant by Mike Walz and Matt Gaetz. That will give the Republicans 2 more members and 2 more votes. And the House is already a close-run thing, so adding 2 more votes to the GOP side is important. Stay tuned. They're making progress. Trump will address the Congress. Tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, President Trump will address a joint session of Congress. Though it will look and feel an awful lot like a State of the Union address, it will not technically be one. The Democrat response will be given by freshman Senator Alyssa Slotkin, who won an open seat race in Michigan while President Trump was carrying the state at the top of the ticket. Now finally to the Jenny Beth Show. Episode 109 of the Jenny Beth Show dropped last Wednesday, featuring Jenny Beth's discussion with Patrice Johnson, founder of Michigan Fair Elections Institute. The two discuss major problems with Michigan's voter rolls, election security, and legislative changes that threaten election integrity. Right now, for instance, the voter registration rate in Michigan is 108%. That's right, there are 8% more people registered to vote in Michigan than there are people who live there. Go figure. The entire episode is fantastic. It's highly recommended. And that's our Washington report for this week. Now for the call to action. This week we're focusing on USAID. You've been reading about it, and we've talked about it in earlier broadcasts. Your tax dollars are being wasted. Your tax dollars are going to fund outrageous projects abroad, transgender surgeries on children in Guatemala, a transgender-themed comic book in Peru, promotion of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workplace, and more. Simply put, USAID has not been accountable to Congress as the Constitution requires. It's time to speak up and let Congress know that Americans want to defund and close USAID permanently. We've put together 2 action pages where you can easily and quickly reach your members of Congress, as well as targeted lists of members, such as committee and subcommittees that handle appropriations for USAID. This way, you can spend 2 minutes of your time to let them know it's time to close the doors at USAID forever. First, go to your Defund and Close USAID action page to contact the relevant U.S. House subcommittee members, the relevant Senate subcommittee members, the congressman who voted to end funding for USAID, and very importantly, the congressman who voted to keep fully funding USAID. Second, visit our Align Act campaign, where you can contact your own congressman and your 2 senators to tell them it's time to defund and shut down USAID. Filling out these 2 forms will only require a couple of minutes. Additionally, the most important thing you can do, if you can spare another couple of minutes after filling out the forms, which will automatically send your emails, please also use the options to call as well. Don't let this opportunity pass by to actually downsize government and make it more accountable to the people. Take action now. As always, if you want to reach out to us, just send an email to jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. And if you want me to answer a question live on air, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. Until then, be well and be active.